almost half of the Pentateuch deals with the events that happened on Mount Sinai. The first part of Exodus, 1 to 19, the deliverance and the journey to Sinai. But from chapter 19 of Exodus through the whole of Leviticus and the first 10 chapters of Numbers deal with the lawmaking, the theophany at Mount Sinai. Now, the fashion has been in Old Testament scholarship, particularly in the last 100 years, is to see these events through one filter, and that's the filter of covenant. And there's, as always, a part truth to it. God made a covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. But there's more to it than just a covenant. And you just read the whole section and you see that how much there is here. I want to talk now about the covenant at Sinai. Now, the most fashionable theory, which is still very, very current, is to see the covenant at Mount Sinai as being analogous to and derived from the Hittite treaties. I've given you a handout there in case you don't know what these Hittite vassal treaties were. They were discovered in the Hittite archives. The Hittites had as their centre of their empire a number of cities in central Turkey, Anatolia. And at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, archaeologists not only excavated these sites, but they deciphered the tablets written in the Hittite language. The Hittites were the great empire, one of the great players from about 1800 through to about 1400 BC. Hittites. And they gained their power because they managed to combine two new kinds of technology. From the tribes to the north of them, they learned to use horses. And not only horses to ride on, but horses to draw chariots and to use it for warfare. So they introduced chariot warfare to the Middle East. These were the tanks, the atomic bombs of the ancient world. And a very small Hittite army with horses and chariots could rout a standing army. That was the number one technology. The second technology that they mastered was that they were one of the first groups in the Middle East to make the transition from bronze culture to iron culture. They mastered ironworking and they made weapons from iron. Now, as you can imagine, you have an iron sword versus a bronze sword in battle. Which is going to be the better? The iron. And iron in those days was worth much more, was far more precious than gold. They mastered it, and for many years they retained a monopoly of it until the Greeks mastered it, and then the Philistines, who were a Greek tribe, employed it against the Israelites. You remember that the Israelites had to go down to the Philistines to buy their iron and to sharpen their iron weapons. Now, because of that, they were created a super empire. They were themselves a very small group, but it was a warrior culture. And they couldn't occupy the territories that they conquered. So they devised a very ingenious political instrument to rule over and to control politically the people that they conquered. They made vassal treaties with their conquered kings. Instead of doing, this is the Hittites, right? Instead of placing their own men over these kingdoms, they allowed the existing kings to go on. So they allowed the existing king, but they bound these kings to them in treaties. These are the so-called vassal treaties, in which the Hittite king made a treaty with a under-king for their mutual advantage. It was a treaty that if either of the two parties were attacked by a third party, the other party would be obligated to come to their assistance. But it also obligated the vassal kingdoms to pay tribute to the Hittite king and to present tax to the Hittite king and to appear once a year before the Hittite king at his palace. Now, these vassal treaties, as I say, come from around 1800 BC. That's where they're dated, around about 1800. And it's in the 1930s that they were deciphered. And then a very famous Old Testament scholar, American Old Testament scholar by the name of Mendenhall, who happened to learn Hittite, said, hey, there's a resemblance here between these treaties and stuff in the Old Testament. So maybe these treaties can help us understand why you get these particular covenants that God makes with his people. But also he noticed this resemblance. And he noticed that of all the parts of the Old Testament, the book of Deuteronomy most closely resembled these treaties. Now, it's a big story. I can't go into it. It's quite an exciting story. It's influenced Old Testament scholar out of all proportion to its value. It was something that they were looking for and gained it. And particularly as it helped to debunk a much liberal theology which said that the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, was written in the post-exilic period. If it was true that, say, the covenant at Sinai and the book of Deuteronomy was influenced by these treaties, then it must be very ancient. Can you see the argument? So it's the reason people got hold of it was historical argument, and many conservative scholars got on it, particularly in North America. And it's a good apologetic device. Now, what's the structure of these treaties? They always begin with a preamble identifying the two parties. The Hittite king is named, I, king, whoop whoop, the great king of the Hittite peoples, and then you get the list of titles that goes as long as your arm. Make this treaty with the vassal. Vassal means the under king. So you get the preamble, the two parties are introduced and identified, and then you get a preamble which identifies the past dealings between the two kingdoms. In some cases, the Hittite king conquered this kingdom and then graciously allowed the king to remain on the throne and allowed the kingdom to observe all its existing customs and laws and political system. So you get the preamble, which identifies the history of the relationship between these two parties. And then you get the stipulations for the treaty. In most cases, they have to do with a mutual alliance, that they are to come to the support of each other if either party comes under attack. And they all, I think most of them from memory, stipulate that the vassal king, together with his chief courtiers, is to appear before the Hittite king once a year and pay homage to the king and bring the annual tribute, the annual tax to the Hittite capital. So you get the stipulations. And the fourth factor is that this treaty is to be deposited. It's to be written either in stone or metal and deposited somewhere in a public place in both kingdoms. So both parties could see this treaty and be reminded of it. And it was to be read once a year. So it was probably read every time that the vassal king came to the Hittite king. The treaty would be reread to remind both parties of the benefits and the obligations of the treaty between these two parties. And here comes the critical part. The treaty was enacted in a temple in the presence of the Hittite gods, and the other party then would, so the Hittites would swear by their gods that they would remain true to the treaty. And let's say if it was the Babylonian king who was having this treaty with them, the Babylonian king would swear by his god, Marduk, and all the gods of Babylon, that he would, at the cost of death, observe this treaty. So the gods were the witnesses to the treaty, and they would therefore make sure that it was kept, and if either party failed to observe the treaty, they would come under divine sanctions, divine punishments from the various gods. And then those, the benefits of the treaty were outlined in terms of blessings and curses. If they observed the treaties, the gods of both parties would bring nothing but blessing to both parties. If either party failed to observe the treaty, then curses would come from the gods to the party that had infringed the contract. Do you get the hang of it? Now, if you're actually interested in it, there's documents from the ancient world. There's dozens of copies of these treaties if you want to wade your way through the turgid prose of them. Yes?
Is there an obvious reason why the emphasis is usually looking at the Old Testament in light of this stuff rather than the other way around? Like, do they influence each other?
Well, that's the question. Who or what influenced what? Well, is there in fact any influence? My own reading of it is that there is there's no direct influence from the Hittite treaties through to any part of the Old Testament. I'm even sceptical about the book of Deuteronomy, which fits it most nearly. But I'll give the main reasons. It's quite as always with historical arguments, they tend to be very complicated. And this is not a history of the Old Testament, so I won't go through all the arguments on both sides. There are later arrangements, law codes from the Assyrians that more closely resemble this. So you get Assyrian law codes which begin with preambles and end with blessings and curses, which in fact resemble this, that more closely resemble what happens on Sinai. Because what you have there is law giving rather than treaty stipulations. But that's another argument. And if you're interested in following it through, I can give you the scholarly material on it. I've given you some references there in the bibliography. Yes?
It's funny because in the archaeological and the record, we don't gain sets at the time. So I'm sure if
yes.
they digged up ALC Constitution and Australian Constitution,
yes.
find a lot of similarities.
Yes.
But it's not as if anything actually really has anything directly to do with the other.
That's right.
Just how we write constitutions.
That's how you write constitutions. And you write constitutions because they have a particular purpose.
Yeah.
So there's similarities. There are influences in using the same language, but the reason to use the same language isn't because the influence of one constitution on the other, but because they use the language of law. That's the common factor. They use legal language, legal terms, because this is a legal document, and there's a tradition of legal language in English and in every other language. Right? So the common factor there would be the use of common legal language and a legal way of thinking, because you've got to make it legally watertight. What's the problems with this? And you'll still find many commentaries that push this basic line, that God, the heavenly king, makes a covenant with his vassal, Israel, at Sinai. Now, already there, you have a problem, because the Hittite vassal treaties weren't between one people and another people, or between a king and a people, but they were between king and king. It doesn't fit. And for it to work, it's got to be king to king. Secondly, this doesn't fit Israel's status as God's people. You see, the main person in the Hittite treaty is your enemy king, the Hittite king. And let's say I'm a Babylonian, so you get Babylonian king plus people. Now, the Hittite king doesn't make a vassal treaty with his own people. There's no point in it. He makes a treaty with a foreign king, and through the foreign king with a foreign people. God makes this covenant at Mount Sinai with whom? Not a foreign people, but his own people. You see that it doesn't fit. They're not exactly analogous. Thirdly, there is no historical preamble. No, there is the story of the Exodus, but you don't get a covenant with a historical preamble. The shortest, there is a little preamble, and this is the only thing scholars can find, as an introduction to the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. You could say, okay, God's identifying himself, number one. He's identifying the parties. You are slaves. I brought you out of Egypt. One sentence, preamble. However, in the Hittite treaties, the preamble is the critical thing because it gives the legal basis for the covenant, the treaty that follows. There's no historical preamble. Secondly, if we take the date of the Exodus, somewhere around 1400 BC, can you see what the problem is? These treaties all go back to 1800 BC and probably even earlier. What's the problem? It's historically very remote and also geographically remote from the events. Now, usually where you get influence, it's influence of two things that are contemporaneous with each other. So I could understand that Australian politics, or say a speech by Rudd, is influenced by a speech by Obama. Okay? It's possible that a speech of Rudd copies a speech that somebody made 400 years ago. It's possible, but it's unlikely. And in any case, if he did, he'd have to change the language completely. But usually influences are at the same time and in the same place. Lastly, or thirdly, there's no deposition of the covenant, the whole covenant. The only closest you get a deposition of the covenant is that Moses writes the Ten Commandments, or God writes the Ten Commandments on 2 tablets of stone, and they are put in the Ark of the Covenant. But that's not the full covenant. That's only a small part of it. If you had the whole of it, you'd have to copy the whole of Exodus chapter 20 through to the end of Leviticus. So there is no deposition, and there are no witnesses to the covenant. And here you get the basic difference. Who made sure that this covenant was kept? On both sides, they were backed by gods. They were witnesses to the treaty, and they made sure that the treaty was observed. Can you see this is impossible because the Old Testament doesn't acknowledge any pagan gods. And if God is the one making a treaty here, then he is the one who witnesses it and makes sure that it is observed. Right? So there's no equivalence here. Lastly, there's no list of blessings and curses. There are some threats, there are some promises, but there's no list of blessings or curses for the observance or non-observance of the covenant. The only place where you'll get that list of blessings and curses is in Leviticus 26, where they have to do not with the covenant, but the results of right or wrong worship. If the Israelites worship as God has commanded, then they will receive blessings. If they reject God, the first commandment, break the first commandment, then God's judgment will come on them. That's Leviticus 26. The only place where you get a list of blessings and curses is at the end of Deuteronomy. The closest you get to this Hittite treatise is the book of Deuteronomy. And you can put a plausible case that it may have been influenced by the Hittite treatise via Assyrian law codes. Right, so it's something old that was recycled, and that you have a king making laws with his people. He introduces himself, and he gives the reason for the legal code, and then you get the legal code of law, and then you get the blessings and curses that follow from the observance of the king's laws or the non-observance of the king's laws. It fits that far better than the Hittite treatise if you want historical influences. Now, I'm not going to go under either of those two. Both of those have some difficulties with. The strongest case can be put for this, both for Deuteronomy and also for Exodus. But any questions on this? Are you familiar with this theory? You come across it? You'll find it everywhere. Oh, yes. And for many people, their whole Old Testament theology stands and falls on the validity of that. I would be a little bit more skeptical about that kind of approach. The danger is, when you go this way, is that you come to a text with certain preconceptions and you don't read the text and read what's out of the text, but what do you do? It's eisegesis. You read things into the text, and that makes you blind to very important features. Now, it's interesting that you can use this approach to make sense of Exodus 19 through to 24. Possibly 24, but it doesn't help you with 25, Exodus 25, all the way through to Numbers 10. All that has to do is liturgical material. And it's interesting that in most modern Old Testament theologies, this stuff is basically overlooked or is regarded as having little significance whatsoever. It doesn't fit the covenant schema. The only way you can make sense of it is to say this here is an expansion of the Ten Commandments. And so the whole purpose of the cult is the people's side of the covenant, obedience to God. Yes?
Just from your lectures as well, and from other reading, whenever the Israelites or when the scriptures reference pagan culture or nearby cultures,
yes,
it turns on its head to a certain
yes,
degree. It will mimic it a lot, but then some crucial thing will be different, or some obvious thing. Is there an argument then that you could say it resembles it in some ways, but then it obviously doesn't resemble it because it's turning it on its head somehow, or it's so that whole massive liturgical kind of
yes.
Part, so you can argue that maybe it wasn't a reference to it, but then also yes, an unreference to it.
Yes, and that would be basically my reading of it. As I've already indicated, I'm more persuaded by these arguments. And what it does is, if you have a look at the Assyrian treatise, it turns the stuff on the head, and it turns the business of worship on the head. And if you think in terms of a covenant being two sides, the surprise is that most of the material here has to do with what God gives the Israelites. There's only very little about what God expects of the Israelites, which is contrary to the way we read it, because from 25 onwards, 25 through the whole of Leviticus is basically ritual legislation. Ritual legislation in which God, first of all, gives the priesthood, the sacrifices, the divine service, the tabernacle to his people. And by these means, God gives himself to the people, access to himself. You could. That would be, if you like, if I want to do it, that would be my reading of it. The emphasis here is not so much on God's demands on his people, which you do if you follow either that legal model or that treaty model, but the emphasis is on God's gifts to his people. God's gifts of the tabernacle, God's gifts of the priesthood, God's gifts of the divine service, which he institutes in the law. His law for them, which establishes that, and makes it possible for him to dwell with his people and bring blessing to them through their interaction with him in the divine service. That's the way I would go, but it's a fairly elaborate argument. And you'll recognise that that's in fact my interpretation, but I'll do it quite apart from any reference to Hittite treaties or Assyrian law codes, because I'm interested in reading the text the way it stands. Just some things about the nature of the covenant at Mount Sinai. It was some years ago that the bleeding obvious struck me. It always helps to use your concordance a lot. Do you know what your concordance is? Your best exegetical tools are dictionary and concordance, but concordance is my number one exegetical thing. Okay, I was doing some work on the covenant at Sinai, and I expected, by using the concordance, to find dozens of references to covenant in Exodus, from Exodus 19 through to Yonks. There are only 4 references in Exodus to the events at Mount Sinai as God's covenant with them. Only 4. And that shows that this is not the main theme here. The theme is God's theophany, God's law-giving, the sanctification of Israel. It only occurs 4 times, and I've listed them there. We'll have a look at least one of them. In 2 cases, it's a repetition. So really, there's only 3 references to covenant at Mount Sinai. And Tom, the first 2, which we'll have a close look at in other contexts, turns all this here on its head. Now, this covenant, but you'll find that it's quite, the events at Sinai are referred to as covenant most frequently in Deuteronomy and in the Deuteronomic history, 1st and 2nd Kings, but not in Exodus. It's only those 4 references, as I said. Now, what's interesting is that this covenant with God at Mount Sinai is enacted by and with and as part of a theophany. Remember the context. They come to Mount Sinai. God summoned Moses up the mountain and says, prepare the people to meet with me. And then he tells Moses to fence off the mountain and to gather for the people to prepare themselves for 3 days. 2 days of preparation. 3rd day is going to be when God appears to them. And then comes the theophany. There's thunder and lightning and clouds and trumpet blast on top of the mountain. The cloud covers the mountain. God's glory is on top of the mountain. And the people are assembled at the bottom of the mountain. And at that point, you have the setup. The language, the kind of imagery is a classical theophany. What you'd expect if this was a pagan story. People at the bottom, 3rd day, everything got ready. The cloud wood, lift and the people would see God. But something funny happens. The people don't see God. God speaks to them directly from the cloud. And this is the only time in the whole of the Old Testament that God speaks directly to his people face to face. From the fire, from the cloud, from the mountain to the Israelites at the bottom of the mountain. But the context then for the covenant is theophany. It has to do with theophany, God's appearance to them. Now, what is the basic point of this covenant? Let me just scrub off some of this. Could you turn to Exodus 19? And take notice of a very important passage. Go to Exodus 19, where God explains what he's going to do. Exodus 19, verse 3 through to the first part of verse 6. I don't know who's next. Nathan, you're it.
Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself."
Right, you've seen the people, this is how he said to address the people, you've seen how I brought you from Egypt to myself here at the mountain. Now, what is it that God intends to do here at the mountain, and that the people give their agreement to? Go on reading.
Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words he will speak to Israel.
Just read the next two verses to get the full context there.
So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words that the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." Moses walked around back to the Lord.
We will do everything the Lord has said. Now, what does the Lord say? Look at it closely. Verse 5 and 6. If you obey me fully, a rather unfortunate translation, the Hebrew verb is shema, with the infinitive absolute. What does shema mean? No, that's with an R. That's with an R. That's to guard, observe, maintain. What's shema? Here, listen. If you listen to me. And then secondly, if you keep my covenant, which covenant? The covenant that I'm about to make with you, then what will you be? What's the point of this covenant? So this covenant has to do with listening to God. And now to keep this covenant, what does God want to do in this covenant? Do any of you pick there? What's God going to do? Then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession, my private property, and you will become for me a royal priesthood, a holy nation. So God's covenant at Mount Sinai has to be with his establishment of the people of Israel as what? A holy nation, a royal priesthood. Just look at the Hebrew. And you, emphatic, will become for me or to me, or you will serve me, Mamlachet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. Now, these are not two separate things, but they qualify each other. You are to be a holy nation. What kind of a holy nation? A kingdom of priests. What's meant by kingdom of priests? It means they are to be the priests of a king. Now, in the ancient world, you had kings, They themselves were priests, and all their courtiers were priests together with the king. So there was no separation of church and state because religion and politics were the same. So the king and his courtiers were priests, and his courtiers were priests together with him. What is God proposing to his people? Well, Israel is already the people of God. But now God, as their holy king, notice the emphasis here on kingly, appoints Israel to be his priesthood. And not just some of them, not just the priests within Israel, but the whole nation is to be the king's priests. And therefore, they are not the king's servants, the king's slaves, but they are the king's courtiers. And since he is holy, they are also holy. He makes them holy. Now, a priest is a person who mediates between a God and other people. So from all the nations of the earth, God chooses Israel. This has already happened. Now, what does he do? He appoints them. He makes them his royal priesthood, his holy nation. So they represent the nations before God. On the other hand, they bring God's blessing from God to the nations. And they are to serve God not just as king, but as priests. Not just as royal courtiers, but as holy courtiers, as priests. They themselves are holy. So what God proposes to do here is to consecrate Israel as a holy nation, as a royal priesthood. Do you get the basic thing? So this covenant doesn't have to do so much with Israel's existence as the people of God, but its mission as the people of God. What is the mission of Israel? To be a holy nation, a royal priesthood. That's the mission of Israel. And the whole of the covenant and all the laws in the covenant have to do with Israel's vocation to be a holy nation. So the Ten Commandments are part of God's covenant with Israel. Now, you don't get a secular ethics here, but you get the ethics of holiness. How are the Israelites to live and act, not just as God's people, but as God's holy people? They are to keep the Ten Commandments. Those Ten Commandments have to do with the holiness of Israel, not just the morality of Israel. They have to do with holiness and Israel's vocation to be a holy, priestly people. If they break the Ten Commandments, they desecrate their holiness and God's holiness. Do you see the way it works? So the law giving is here for Israel's vocation as a holy nation. And there are four elements then in the enactment of the covenant. First of all, the framework is theophany. Okay? You get God's appearance to Israel and God speaking to Israel. It begins with God's announcement and Israel's agreement to this covenant. Okay? Remember, the people agree. What the Lord has said, we will do. In other words, yeah, we're happy to go along with this covenant. Notice, when it was God's covenant with Noah, God didn't ask for Noah's permission and acquiescence. It was just given. When it came to Abraham, it was just given. But the covenant at Sinai involves agreement, consent on the part of Israel. Now this is very important. You'll see it later on coming in again. So the first part of the covenant is God's announcement of what he intends to do, his policy, to get Israel's agreement. Then you get the giving of the Ten Commandments, which he gave directly to his people. And this is followed by the end of chapter 20 on the law for the altar. The altar as the place of worship, the place where God will come and bless his people. So God appears at Sinai, but in future the place where God will meet with his people is not Sinai, but the altar. The altar is the mobile Mount Sinai. That's the ongoing place of God's blessing. So the altar law is attached very closely to the Ten Commandments. And then in chapters 21 to 23, you get what scholars call the Covenant Code. These are laws for Israel's life as a holy people with their holy God as they journey through the desert to the Promised Land. So you get the Covenant Code. So there's the giving of law here, the second element. The third part is the consecration of Israel for God's service. We'll have a closer look at that a little bit later, but you remember Moses is told to get some young men to slaughter a large number of animals. Half of the blood from those animals is poured at the altar at the foot of the mountain, and the other half of the blood is sprinkled over over the people. Now, if that blood is sprinkled on the altar, then it becomes most holy. And if the blood then from the altar is sprinkled on the people, what does that blood do? It makes them a holy nation. It consecrates them as the priesthood of the heavenly King. Now, that's not the normal interpretation. Most modern scholars see this ceremony as the sealing of the covenant, whatever that means, the sealing of the covenant, rather than the consecration of Israel. The fourth factor in God's covenant is the institution of the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the divine service. If the Ten Commandments are what God requires of Israel as his holy people, God's gift to his people are the tabernacle, the priesthood, the divine service. And then the third part is the reaffirmation of the covenant after the incident with the golden calf, which is very important. Even Israel's breaking of the first commandment doesn't annul God's covenant with his people. It's reaffirmed after the incident of the golden calf. So those are the 5 elements in the enactment of the covenant. Any questions on that? Now, for the next couple of weeks, I want to look closely at the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. I've given you a summary in tabular form of the difference between the 2 versions of the 10 Commandments. We have 2 versions. One's in Exodus, the other one's in Deuteronomy. Please look closely at them and work out how they resemble each other and how they differ from each other. So look closely at the 10 Commandments. I'm spending quite a bit of time on this because this is part of your job as a pastor, to teach the 10 Commandments. It's part of our catechism, and Jesus reaffirms very, very strongly the importance of the 10 Commandments for Christians and not just Jews. So you need to understand the 10 Commandments, and particularly the first 3 commandments are the most difficult. We'll be having a look at them in turn.